Hello, and welcome to Scott's Odyssey. I was preparing a trip out to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, the world's first refuge for hawks, eagles, falcons, and vultures, proclaimed as a global raptor conservation site. That was until I came across a story of Hawk Mountain's old tavern, a location for a different type of raptor, one that would kill people and possibly turn them into sausage for its customers. That raptor's name was Pennsylvania's first serial killer, Matthias Schombach. See you in a minute. Welcome back. If you've watched my videos before, thank you for your patronage, and if you're new to Scott's Odyssey, welcome aboard. Now, before we get into the comments that do not yet exist, but surely will if I don't address them immediately, the word of mouth legend speaks of a man named Matthias Schombach and the Schombach Tavern. Please know that the tavern's actual name was Schambach and named after Matthias Schombach. I'm sorry that many of we Westerners have a problem with other people's languages and name pronunciations. The spelling of Schambach, Schombach, and Schambach are all pronounced in German English, meaning the English spoken by the Germans who came here a long time ago. And so it's spoken as Schambach. More so, those who do not realize that there is no Matthias name in pronunciation, the name, whether it's spelled in any of these variations, is still pronounced Matthias, and is both the Hebrew and Greek form of Matthew, meaning gift from God. With that out of the way, let's learn a little bit more about this gift from God. Oh, wait, disclaimer number 2. When I started, I stated I was initially looking into going up to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary for the raptors. Here's the disclaimer. I have not spoken with the sanctuary. I am not sponsored by the sanctuary. I do not represent the sanctuary, and the story here within is not a reflection of the sanctuary or its mission. The story just so happens to be at a location that's now part of the sanctuary. So let's go find out who we once were, shall we? It all started in the Pennsylvania territory of Alemangal, a German word for all lack. But as a Pennsylvania Dutch phrase, it means land of wanton fertile soil. Because, well, the land was really not very farmable, nor was the soil fertile, and it was full of rocks. On February 15th of 1756, Valentine Probst, a prominent plantation owner in Albany Township of Berks County, Pennsylvania, wrote a letter to Mr. Levon. I can only assume this is Jacob Levon, the brother of Valentine's wife, Katharina, and another prominent plantation owner within Berks County. In his letter, he pleads that he cannot omit writing about the dreadful circumstances within Albany. He states the Indians ran upon him and followed him into a field 10 or 12 perches off. That's about 160, 200 feet away. He then claims he escaped the Indians and ran toward Jacob Gerhart's house with a design to fetch some arms. When he came near Gerhart's, he heard a lamentable cry, "Lord Jesus, Lord Jesus," which made him run back toward his own house. But before he got quite home, he saw his house and stables in flames and heard the cattle bellowing, and thereupon ran away again. 2 of his children were shot. One of them was found dead in a field. The other was found alive and brought to Hakenbrook's house, but died 3 hours after. All his grain and cattle are burned up. At Jacob Gerhart's, they have killed 1 man, 2 women, and 6 children. 2 children slipped under the bed, one of which burned to death. The other escaped and ran a mile to get to the people. We desire help, or we must leave our homes. And thus is the story of the Jacob Gerhart family massacre. But this was just the beginning of yet another, more atrocious story. Jacob Gerhart lost his family. In 1793, Jacob Gerhart, no, not the Jacob Gerhart we were just talking about, but the now 48-year-old man who was 11-year-old boy who ran a mile to get to the people during the massacre, returned to Albany Township. On the high side of Hawk Mountain, which at this time was called Blue Mountain, he built a new home right along an old Indian trail and overlooking the old plantation where his family was decimated. He operated his home as a tavern right from the start, assisting weary travelers who were coming from the Great Valley and traveling to the west. In 1851, the building was initially rented to and then acquired by the young Matthias and Becky Schombach, who continued the tavern tradition established by Gerhart. I state young because Matthias was born in Germany on March 4th, 1824, came to the United States in 1848, making him a man just entering into his mid-20s. Due to the time period, the majority of the people who would come through this area were no longer people seeking the west, but hucksters and farmers crossing the mountain from Berks County into the settlements of Orwigsburg and Pottsville, as well as quarry workers and teamsters from the coal mines in Schuylkill County. It's said that Matthias was of extremely wealthy blood and had money to throw around. He was acclaimed as a wonderful person who loved to serve the people who came to stay at the tavern and frequently let them drink on the house. Things that someone born with a silver spoon in their mouth would be prone to do when they own their own party place. Equally, his wife was highly spoken about as a positive and wholesome person whom everyone loved. But at the same time, it's said that Matthias had a gambling problem and could become quick to anger when under the influence of alcohol. Over time, Matthias was not very liked by the locals. And it's said that the townspeople often were told horror stories of occurrences during the stay at the tavern by people who stayed there overnight. It was also said that many of the people who traveled the road that passed the tavern were simply never seen again. Within the local community, suspicions arose when Matthias began bringing clothing and jewelry into town to sell. It got even worse when he started selling leftover Civil War surplus at the Reading Market. You see, a well-known peddler who had been selling the same thing at the Reading Market mysteriously disappeared after stating to the vendors he would be lodging at the Schambachs on his way north. As the townspeople continued to chatter about Matthias being seemingly off, and then the rumors of screams in the woods being heard near the tavern started, Becky became the interference runner, squashing any rumors by stating her husband was under a lot of stress and prone to minor breakdowns. This is when things got interesting. It's believed that when Matthias would suffer an anger issue, he would make the alcohol on the house in order to have the guests get so full of food and drink they'd become overly burdensome with sleep. Once they were long asleep, he would take those guests outside to the barn and hack their bodies into pieces, drop their heads down into a well, and spread their other body parts around in the woods to let the animals consume them. He would then take their money for himself, and all their possessions would be taken into town and sold. At a later point in their tavern management, a new item appeared on the menu. It was called Old German Sausage. One traveler claimed that the meat didn't taste right, and he became concerned when he realized there was no livestock or pigs anywhere on the property. He claimed he only survived because he realized what was going on and made a hasty escape before nightfall. Another traveler by the name of Featherolf heard sounds of distress in the barn. When he opened the barn door, he found Matthias holding a bloody hatchet. Matthias saw him and yelled, "Go away, or I'll sink this hatchet into your head." Yet, we find in an August 17th, 1877 newspaper story that claims Matthias was a great man. It makes claims that due to the large abundance of wildlife on this part of the mountain, that Schambach was a great place for hunters to stay. The paper read that the hunting furor in Albany Township is so great that an extensive arsenal and hunter's depot has been established on the summit of the Blue Mountain by Matthew, who has one of the largest stocks of guns, rifles, carbines, and revolvers to be found in any establishment in the county. Curiously enough, nothing ever came of the allegations and rumors poised at Matthias and his tavern. That is, until 1879. Apparently, Matthias had spiraled into a truly demented madness. On his deathbed, nearly 30 years after his start with the tavern, Matthias requested a religious leader for confessions and last rites. In his confession, he stated that he had robbed and murdered so many people that he cannot remember any more than the final 11 or so. They came after his wells had become too full of human skulls. Yes, wells. 3 of them to be exact. Too full of human skulls. Apparently, so many skulls were placed in these wells that Matthias had to stop disposing of heads in wells because they were all full. Be aware, the average well in Albany, Pennsylvania is 100 to 200 feet deep, and depending on how high up the mountain you are, it can be upwards of 1,000 feet deep. It's unknown if too filled meant a bucket could no longer get the water out, or that you could see the skulls when you look down into the well. Either way, even if we're just talking about filling the bottom to where a bucket cannot fetch the water, it would mean that there were a minimum of 20 to 30 heads in the bottom of each of these 3 wells. Matthias described in detail murdering these souls with an axe, removing their flesh, and leaving their remaining bones and organs in the woods so that animals would pick them clean. When asked, "Why did you do this?" he responded with, "These deeds were not my own, but that of a great evil living in the mountain that whispered to me constantly, urging me to murder these people, even when I slept." Matthias Schombach was not the only Matthias who lived on Blue Mountain. Sometime around 1860, about 8 years after the Schombachs moved to the tavern, a quiet and secluded man named Matthias Berger moved onto the mountain and built himself a mud hut on the slope. Matthias Berger was a devout Catholic living a simple hermit's life. The locals referred to him by der alt modus, meaning the old-fashioned, a term of respect and endearment. He was never known to bother anyone and was only seen when attending church or coming to town to buy supplies. In 1890, a decade after the death of Matthias Schombach, the mountain apparently was hungry, so it went back to work. Harry Mole, a fellow parishioner and friend of Matthias Berger, decided to drop in on him and see how he was doing while he was out looking for bees. When he reached Berger's home, the door was ripped off and the furniture inside was strewn about. The outdoor kitchen utensils were all full of water, and well, it hadn't rained for 3 weeks. More importantly, Matthias Berger was missing. Being that he was 77 years old, Harry went back to the community with this information and they formed a search party immediately to go looking for him. Matthias Berger was found nearly 2 miles away along the old Indian road, face down in a pile of rocks with outturned pockets. He was apparently robbed and beaten to death, and his murderer was never found. Shortly after the death of Matthias Berger, the abandoned tavern was bought by William Turner. William Turner fixed up the building, raised a family of 8 children, and turned the building back into a tavern for passing travelers. Many of the clients were hawk hunters who would go to the mountaintop and shoot down hawks. The Turners ended their time with the tavern upon a horrific accident. One of their daughters, while playing her whistle, stumbled and fell down the steps to the tavern basement. Unfortunately, she died due to the fall. And of course, people claim you can still hear her haunted whistle tune when you go and stay there at night. According to the much more recent curator of the property, it's said that the old records of the tavern from the time of William Turner state that the Turners found human remains in 3 wells on the property and in a hedgerow behind the building. This included skulls and bones from human skeletons. In 1922, the tavern was picked up by John E. Wenz. Shortly after Wenz moved in, the local community began to suspect something weird was going on, because they often were seeing lights and hearing odd noises late into the night. So much so that the local authorities found a need to actually investigate the rumors that were coming from the townspeople. With enough warrant, in 1930, prohibition agents raided the property. Lo and behold, there was a shootout with bootleggers staying at the property, and a gin mill was found. After remaining abandoned for the next 8 years, the property was picked up by the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. And for all intents and purposes, that's the end of the curse of Hawk Mountain and the Schombach Tavern. Now, you may be wondering how much of this story could possibly be true. Well, let's dig into that right now. The story of Jacob Gerhart is mostly true, only with minor issues in the translations done about his story from Probst. For example, the story says that Probst's letter stated he heard a lamentable cry of Lord Jesus, but what he actually heard was Jesus, ik leben durch dich, Jesus, ik sterbe in dir, meaning Jesus, I live by thee, Jesus, I die in thee. Other than that, the story matches the history. Now, let's move on to Matthias Schombach and see if his story doesn't line up. Well, you see, well, it all lines up. Yeah, the main story of Matthias is, as far as we know, 99% true. The 1% that is not true is that his wife's name was not Becky, it was Margaret. Everything else is true. Now, there are no legal records found of any bones found on the property by the Turners, but there would also have been no reason for it to be investigated for crimes committed 20 to 50 years earlier, nor any record of missing people, and for all they knew, they were pulling bones of Indians or some other even older people out of the well and off of the property. You see, even today, we move headstones from old cemeteries and leave bodies interned where we build entire communities on top of them. Even the movie Poltergeist, the good one from 1982, not that garbage reboot in 2015, had a scene where they're digging out a swimming pool, and unfortunately they ran into old grave sites. Yeah, I know it was a movie, but you do realize that they were not fake corpses in the movie. They were actual corpses that were used to make that scene. Go look it up. Anyway, unlike the telling of other stories where history becomes skewed to an unrecognizable state over time, the story of Schombach Tavern is most likely 98% absolute truth. The story about the hermit, Matthias Berger, is also 100% true and is recorded in multiple newspapers at the time and retold in papers up to and including the September 15, 1949 issue of the Pennsylvania Dutchman, which was a paper dedicated to Pennsylvania Dutch culture out of Lancaster. Now, as for the records of the tavern, the truth there drops down to about 85% because nobody's reproduced these documents. But the curator of the property at that time had no reason to lie, no reason to call attention to the property with such negative value, and no financial gain to tell the story of bones nor report it to the authorities because it was something found by the previous tenant. The curator's only concern would be to make sure none of the bones were there now and that the information was disclosed to the purchasing tenant of the property in the future. The story of John Wenz and the bootleggers, again, completely true. The building truly was raided by prohibition agents based on claims from the local community that there were weird lights and odd noises during the late hours of the night, and a gin still was found with accompanying bootleggers at the site that ultimately led to a shootout. The only time any weird stories, ghost stories, hauntings, or any form of paranormal stuff comes about was after the purchase of the site by the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary and the specific personnel of this organization who stayed at the renovated tavern turned cottage where Maurice and Irma Brown. Not only were they fascinated by the history, but they proclaimed that they themselves are the ones who added a few more interesting parts to the known stories of this site. Yes, it was the original caretakers of the sanctuary in 1938 who made up all these stories of ghosts, paranormal, hearing sounds, feeling evil things, etc., that you would hear in the embellishments of the actual Matthias Schombach, Matthias Berger, William Turner stories, including quite a few of their own ghost stories and tales of things that they found on the mountain, none of which is provable. Why they felt it was necessary to make up stories is beyond me. But it's not dissimilar to self-proclaimed historians who tell a story without the history, instead of letting the history tell the story. But as for the original histories of who we once were, that which I have told you here today about the tavern are all the true stories found in the history of Hawk Mountain. If you enjoyed learning about the real story of who we once were in the Schombach Tavern, give the video a like. Take a moment to subscribe for more ODDySEEy histories. Share the video out to people you think might be interested and leave a comment below with your thoughts about when truth is stranger than folktales. As always, I thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video.
Thank you.